Have you ever thought about why entire organizations collapse when one key person leaves? Why do powerful movements disintegrate after their leader is removed? Why does eliminating a single individual sometimes accomplish what years of fighting the entire group could not? This video will change how you see leadership, power structures, and the invisible architecture of influence that makes or breaks collective action. Today we're diving into Law 42 from the 48 Laws of Power: strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. But this isn't just about targeting leaders or decapitation strategies. This is about understanding one of the most fundamental principles of organized power, that groups depend on key individuals far more than they realize. That removing the right person at the right time can destroy entire organizations. That power concentrated in individuals creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited with surgical precision. Let me tell you a story that will reveal everything. In the early 1300s, a powerful religious movement called the Cathars threatened the Catholic Church's dominance in southern France. The Cathars had hundreds of thousands of followers, their own churches, their own clergy, their own theology. They were well organized, deeply committed, and growing rapidly. The Catholic Church tried for decades to suppress them through preaching and persuasion. Nothing worked. The movement seemed unstoppable. Then Pope Innocent III changed strategy. Instead of fighting the entire movement, he identified the key leaders, the prefecti, who were the spiritual shepherds of Cathar communities. He launched the Albigensian Crusade, but the military campaign focused specifically on capturing or killing these key leaders. Town by town, region by region, the prefecti were systematically eliminated. Without their spiritual leaders, Cathar communities fragmented. Followers didn't know how to maintain the complex theological practices. New leaders couldn't be properly ordained without the prefecti. The organizational structure collapsed. Within 2 generations, a movement of hundreds of thousands had effectively disappeared. Not because the followers were defeated, but because their shepherds had been struck and the sheep scattered. The Catholic Church understood something profound: organizations are not actually collective entities with distributed power. They're hierarchical structures that depend critically on specific individuals. Remove those individuals, and the organization doesn't just weaken, it often disintegrates completely. The followers might remain, but without leadership, coordination, and direction, they become individually powerless. This reveals a fundamental truth about human organization. We're told that movements are about ideas, that organizations are collective enterprises, that power is distributed among the group. This is mythology. Reality is that most organizations are held together by a small number of key individuals. Remove those individuals, and the organization collapses regardless of how many followers remain or how strong the ideas supposedly are. Now let me take you back 2 million years to understand why humans organize this way. Our ancestors evolved in groups with clear hierarchical structures. Alpha leaders made decisions. Followers implemented them. This hierarchy was efficient for coordination and survival. Groups with clear leadership outcompete groups trying to operate by consensus. Natural selection favored hierarchical organization with concentrated leadership. Your brain today is wired to look for leaders and follow them. You're cognitively designed to organize hierarchically rather than democratically. This makes human groups vulnerable to decapitation because removing the leader disrupts the entire organizational structure that everyone's brain is designed to maintain. Without the leader, the hierarchical structure collapses and the group fragments into individuals who no longer know how to coordinate. This evolutionary wiring is why Law 42 works so consistently across all human contexts. It's not a cultural artifact or historical accident. It's built into how human brains organize collective action. The shepherd-sheep dynamic is fundamental to human social organization. Understanding this allows you to exploit it when attacking organizations and defend against it when building them. Fast forward to ancient warfare, and we see this principle deployed with devastating effectiveness. Alexander the Great understood that killing enemy commanders was more valuable than killing enemy soldiers. In battle after battle, he targeted opposing generals and kings. Once the commander fell, enemy armies would often break and flee even when they still outnumbered Alexander's forces. The sheep scattered when their shepherd was struck. At the Battle of Gaugamela, Alexander faced Darius III of Persia with a massive Persian army that outnumbered his forces perhaps 5-1. Alexander didn't try to defeat the entire Persian army. He led a cavalry charge directly at Darius's position. When Darius saw Alexander coming for him personally and fled the battlefield, the entire Persian army collapsed. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers scattered because their shepherd had been struck and fled. This wasn't cowardice by the Persian soldiers. It was the rational response to loss of command structure. Without Darius and his generals providing coordination and orders, the soldiers had no way to fight effectively as an army. They reverted to individuals concerned with personal survival. Alexander won not by defeating the Persian army but by striking its shepherd, which caused the sheep to scatter. This pattern repeats throughout military history. Battles are won by killing commanders more often than by killing soldiers. Wars are won by decapitating leadership more often than by destroying armies. The side that protects its command structure while destroying the enemy's command structure wins regardless of numbers or resources. The shepherd-sheep dynamic is the decisive factor. Now let me show you how this operates in modern organizational contexts, because every company, institution, and movement has shepherds whose removal would cause the sheep to scatter. Identifying these individuals is essential both for attacking organizations and for defending them. Think about startups and how dependent they are on founders. The founder is usually the visionary, the person who recruited the team, the one who maintains the culture, the source of strategic direction. Remove the founder, and startups often collapse immediately. The team might be talented, the technology might be sound, the market opportunity might be real, but without the shepherd who organized and directed everything, the sheep scatter. You see this constantly. Founder leaves or dies, startup implodes. Investors lose faith, employees leave, customers cancel, suppliers stop extending credit. Not because anything changed about the product or market, but because the organizational structure was built around the founder as shepherd. Without that shepherd, the structure collapses and everyone scatters to new opportunities. Or consider political movements. They're usually built around charismatic leaders who provide vision, inspire commitment, coordinate action, and maintain cohesion among diverse factions. Remove the leader, and movements typically fragment immediately. The followers remain committed to the ideas, but they can't agree on direction, they compete for leadership, they split into factions. The movement scatters because its shepherd was struck. This is why assassination has been such a consistent tool throughout history. It's not about killing one person. It's about destroying entire organizations by removing the shepherd that holds them together. One well-placed assassination can accomplish what years of conventional conflict cannot. This is deeply uncomfortable, but it's absolutely real in how power operates at the level of organizations and movements. Understanding this means you must identify who the real shepherds are in any organization you're analyzing. It's not always the official leaders. Sometimes it's the person who actually makes decisions, who maintains relationships, who holds institutional knowledge, who everyone depends on for coordination. These are the individuals whose removal would cause organizational collapse. They're the vulnerabilities in the organization's structure. Now here's where this gets really dark, and I need you to pay close attention because this is the twist that changes everything. Law 42 means that building organizations around charismatic individual leaders, while effective for coordination, creates catastrophic vulnerabilities. The more effective the leader, the more dependent the organization becomes, and the more devastating their removal would be. Success creates vulnerability. Think about what this means for organizational design. The temptation is always to build around strong leaders because strong leadership is effective. It creates clear direction, inspired followers, efficient coordination. Organizations with strong shepherds outperform organizations with weak or distributed leadership in the short term. But this short-term effectiveness creates long-term fragility. The organization built around a strong shepherd has a single point of failure. Remove that one person, and everything collapses. The organization has become so dependent on the shepherd that it cannot function without them. The followers have been turned into sheep who cannot operate independently. The efficiency of centralized leadership has created the vulnerability of organizational collapse through decapitation. This creates a tragic paradox. Strong leadership makes organizations effective but fragile. Weak or distributed leadership makes organizations ineffective but resilient. You must choose between effectiveness and resilience because the structures that create one tend to destroy the other. There's no perfect solution, only trade-offs between different failure modes. Most organizations choose effectiveness over resilience because the costs of ineffective leadership are immediate and visible while the costs of fragility are distant and hypothetical. They build around strong shepherds, achieve success through that strong leadership, and only discover their vulnerability when it's too late and the shepherd is struck. The sheep scatter, the organization collapses, and everyone wonders how such a successful organization could disappear so quickly. Let me show you how Law 42 operates in the context of information and communication networks, because modern organizations depend not just on leaders but on key connectors who maintain the flow of information and relationships. Remove the right connector, and you can fragment networks even without removing formal leaders. Think about organizations as networks of relationships and information flows. Most organizations have a few individuals who are exceptionally well connected. They know everyone. They facilitate communication between different parts of the organization. They're the nodes through which most information flows. These people might not have impressive titles, but they're actually more essential to organizational functioning than many formal leaders. Remove one of these key connectors, and the network fragments. Different parts of the organization stop communicating effectively. Information silos form. Coordination breaks down. The organization doesn't necessarily collapse completely, but it becomes much less effective because the information flows that enabled coordination have been severed. The network shepherd has been struck, and the network sheep scatter into isolated groups. This is why organizations should map their actual communication networks, not just their formal org charts. The org chart shows formal authority. The communication network shows actual information flows and key dependencies. The people who are critical nodes in the communication network are the organizational shepherds in practice, regardless of their official position. Losing them would cause significant organizational disruption. Sophisticated organizations protect these key connectors and systematically reduce dependence on them over time. They document what these people know. They develop redundant connections so information can flow through multiple paths. They ensure that critical relationships and knowledge aren't concentrated in any single individual. They're defending against Law 42 by reducing the number of shepherds whose removal would scatter the sheep. But most organizations don't do this because they don't recognize the vulnerability until it's too late. The key connector quits or retires, and suddenly everyone realizes how much depended on that person. Information stops flowing. Relationships fall apart. Coordination breaks down. The organization scrambles to replace what was lost but often cannot because the knowledge and relationships were personal and tacit rather than documented and transferable. Now let me take you into how Law 42 operates in the context of expertise and technical knowledge, because organizations also depend on individuals who possess critical specialized knowledge. Remove the person with essential expertise, and entire capabilities can disappear even though many people remain. Think about the engineer who's the only person who really understands the critical system. Or the salesperson who has all the key client relationships. Or the operations person who's the only one who knows how things actually work versus how they're supposed to work. These individuals are shepherds of organizational capabilities. Remove them, and those capabilities often disappear even though the systems and clients remain. This is the bus factor problem. How many people would need to get hit by a bus before the project or organization fails? For many organizations and projects, the bus factor is embarrassingly low. 1 or 2 key people hold so much essential knowledge that their departure would cripple the organization. They're shepherds whose removal would scatter the sheep's ability to function effectively. The defense against this vulnerability requires systematically reducing bus factors through documentation, cross-training, and knowledge distribution. But this is difficult because the people with essential knowledge are usually too busy using that knowledge to document or teach it. They're also often incentivized to maintain their indispensability rather than make themselves replaceable. The organization needs them to share knowledge, but they benefit from keeping it concentrated in themselves. This creates another paradox. The individuals most essential to the organization have personal incentives to remain essential by keeping knowledge concentrated rather than distributed. They're rational to resist knowledge sharing that would make them replaceable. The organization must somehow incentivize knowledge distribution by people who benefit from knowledge concentration. This is a difficult alignment problem that most organizations solve poorly or not at all. The result is that organizations remain vulnerable to expertise-based decapitation. Lose the key technical expert, and the capability disappears. Lose the key relationship manager, and the clients leave. Lose the key operations person, and processes break down. The sheep scatter because the shepherd of that particular capability is gone and no one else can provide the expertise that shepherd embodied. Let me show you how Law 42 operates in competitive business contexts where striking competitor shepherds is a legitimate and common tactic. Poaching key employees, especially leaders and critical experts, is a way of striking the shepherd to make the competitor's sheep scatter. This is corporate warfare through targeted decapitation. Think about what happens when you recruit away a competitor's key person. Maybe their top salesperson who has all the client relationships. Maybe their lead engineer who understands the core technology. Maybe their operations manager who keeps everything running. When that person leaves, the competitor's organization often falls into chaos. Clients leave. Projects stall. Operations break down. You've struck their shepherd and their sheep are scattering. This is why companies invest so heavily in retention of key people. It's not just about keeping valuable employees. It's about preventing competitors from decapitating your organization through strategic poaching. The golden handcuffs, the retention bonuses, the equity vesting schedules, all of this is defense against Law 42. You're protecting your shepherds from being struck by competitors who understand that removing them would scatter your sheep. The arms race in executive compensation is partly driven by this dynamic. Companies must pay enough to prevent key people from being poached, while competitors must pay enough to successfully poach key people from rivals. The compensation keeps escalating because the strategic value of decapitating competitors by poaching their shepherds is enormous. One successful poach can destroy a competitor worth millions or billions. This also explains non-compete agreements and their controversy. Companies want to prevent key employees from taking knowledge and relationships to competitors. Employees want the freedom to move and leverage their knowledge. Courts try to balance these interests. But the fundamental dynamic is that companies are trying to defend against Law 42 by preventing their shepherds from being struck and immediately joining competitors who could exploit the disruption. Now let me take you into how Law 42 operates in social movements and activism, because movements are particularly vulnerable to decapitation since they often depend even more heavily on charismatic leaders than formal organizations do. Remove the right activist leader, and entire movements can collapse. Think about how governments respond to movements they want to suppress. They don't try to arrest or suppress all the followers. They identify the key leaders, the shepherds who coordinate action, who inspire commitment, who maintain movement cohesion. Then they arrest, exile, co-opt, or eliminate those leaders. Without the shepherds, the movement fragments and often disappears even though the followers remain and the grievances persist. You see this throughout history. Labor movements decapitated through arresting union leaders. Independence movements disrupted through exiling nationalist leaders. Reform movements neutralized through co-opting or discrediting key activists. The tactic is universal because the vulnerability is universal. Movements depend on shepherds, and striking those shepherds scatters the sheep. The defense requires movements to build distributed leadership structures where multiple people can coordinate action and no single leader is indispensable. This is organizationally difficult and often ideologically uncomfortable because movements celebrate their heroes and build narratives around charismatic leaders. But movements that fail to build distributed leadership remain vulnerable to decapitation. Some movements understand this and deliberately avoid creating individual heroes. They emphasize collective action and distributed leadership. They rotate visible leadership so no one becomes the shepherd whose removal would scatter everyone. This makes them more resilient but often less effective at inspiring and coordinating because collective leadership lacks the efficiency and emotional power of charismatic individual leadership. Once again, we see the trade-off between effectiveness and resilience. Movements with strong charismatic leaders are more effective at inspiring and mobilizing but more vulnerable to decapitation. Movements with distributed leadership are more resilient but often less effective at achieving their goals. There's no perfect solution, only choices between different failure modes. Let me show you how Law 42 operates in the context of family businesses and dynasties, because families that concentrate leadership in one individual create succession crises when that individual dies or becomes incapacitated. The family business shepherd is struck, and the family sheep scatter into conflict over succession. Think about wealthy families where the patriarch or matriarch makes all major decisions, holds all the relationships, controls all the assets. When that person dies, the family often falls apart. Siblings fight over inheritance. Businesses collapse without the leader's direction. Relationships with partners and clients fall apart. The unified family scatters into competing factions because the shepherd who held everything together is gone. This is predictable and preventable, yet it happens constantly because family leaders resist distributing power while they're alive. They want to maintain control. They don't trust the next generation. They haven't developed succession plans. They've created themselves as indispensable shepherds, which guarantees chaos when they're eventually struck by death or incapacity. The sophisticated family leader distributes leadership gradually while still alive. They develop multiple potential successors. They ensure key relationships and knowledge aren't concentrated in themselves. They create governance structures that don't depend on any single individual. They turn themselves from indispensable shepherd into one of several leaders, which makes their eventual departure manageable rather than catastrophic. But this requires ego subordination that many successful family leaders struggle with. They built the family fortune. They made the key decisions. They maintain the relationships. Why should they diminish themselves and empower others who might not be as capable? This ego resistance is what creates the succession crises that destroy family enterprises. The leader's refusal to stop being the sole shepherd guarantees disaster when they're struck. Now let me take you into how Law 42 operates in crisis situations where the normal shepherd is removed and the group must somehow continue without them. Some groups scatter immediately. Others find new shepherds and continue. Understanding what determines these different outcomes reveals what makes organizations resilient versus fragile. Think about military units when commanders are killed. Some units immediately break and flee. Others have subordinate officers who step up, maintain command, and continue fighting effectively. The difference is whether the organization has developed depth of leadership or concentrated everything in the top commander. Units with leadership depth survive decapitation. Units with concentrated leadership scatter when decapitated. The same applies to all organizations in crisis. When the CEO dies suddenly, does the company continue smoothly with the COO or other executives taking over? Or does it fall into chaos because everything depended on the CEO? When the founder leaves, does the startup continue with the existing team? Or does it collapse because everything was the founder's vision and relationships? The organizations that survive decapitation have usually either deliberately built leadership depth or accidentally had strong subordinate leaders who could step up. The organizations that scatter usually concentrated too much in the top shepherd and never developed potential replacement shepherds who could maintain the flock when the primary shepherd was struck. This suggests that organizational resilience requires developing what military organizations call depth of leadership. Multiple people capable of taking command. Knowledge and relationships distributed rather than concentrated. Clear succession plans and practice transitions. Organizations that invest in leadership depth pay costs in efficiency and simplicity but gain resilience against decapitation. Let me show you how Law 42 operates in technological systems, Because modern organizations increasingly depend on technical infrastructure where key systems act as shepherds and their failure scatters the organizational sheep. This is a non-human version of the same principle where critical dependencies create catastrophic vulnerabilities. Think about organizations that depend on a single critical system. Maybe a database that contains all customer information. Maybe a manufacturing system that's the bottleneck in production. Maybe a communication platform that everyone depends on. When that system fails, the entire organization can grind to halt even though all the people remain. The technical shepherd has been struck, and the organizational sheep scatter into confused inactivity. The sophisticated organization identifies single points of failure in technical infrastructure and builds redundancy. Backup databases. Alternative manufacturing capacity. Redundant communication systems. This is expensive and complex, but it's defense against technical decapitation. You're ensuring no single system failure can scatter your organizational sheep. But most organizations accept single points of failure because redundancy is expensive and the risk seems hypothetical until it materializes. Then when the critical system fails, they discover how dependent they were. Operations stop. Customers can't be served. Revenue disappears. The technical shepherd was struck, and everything scatters until the system can be restored. This is increasingly dangerous as organizations become more dependent on complex technical infrastructure. The potential for catastrophic failure from single system breakdowns keeps increasing. Organizations that don't invest in resilience against technical decapitation are gambling that their critical systems won't fail. Many lose that gamble. Now let me take you into how Law 42 operates at the level of ideas and narratives, because organizations can also be held together by key narratives or ideas that act as cognitive shepherds. Challenge or discredit those narratives, and belief systems can scatter even without removing any people. Think about religious or ideological organizations built around specific beliefs. If those core beliefs are decisively challenged or disproven, the organization can collapse even though the people and leadership remain intact. The cognitive shepherd has been struck. The believers scatter because the narrative that organized their belief system is gone. You see this when scientific evidence contradicts religious claims. When historical research undermines nationalist narratives. When economic failures discredit ideological theories. The organization doesn't necessarily disappear immediately, but it enters crisis. Believers fragment into those who maintain faith despite evidence, those who try to reinterpret the narrative, and those who abandon it entirely. The cognitive sheep scatter because their shepherd narrative was struck. The defense is building belief systems that don't depend on easily falsifiable specific claims. Religious organizations that ground faith in personal experience rather than historical claims. Ideological movements that emphasize values rather than specific predictions. Nationalist narratives that focus on cultural identity rather than historical mythology. These more resilient belief structures can survive challenges to specific claims because they don't depend on any single shepherd narrative. But many organizations build around brittle narratives precisely because those narratives are emotionally powerful and effective for coordination. The specific historical claim. The definitive prediction. The absolute truth. These are effective shepherds for organizing belief, but they create vulnerability to being struck by contrary evidence. Once again, effectiveness and resilience trade off against each other. Let me show you one extended final case study that demonstrates Law 42 operating at the highest level across multiple dimensions. In the early 21st century, Al-Qaeda was a terrorist organization that seemed incredibly dangerous and resilient. It had carried out devastating attacks. It had inspired followers worldwide. It seemed like a global threat that would require massive resources to defeat. Then the United States focused on decapitation strategy. Through intelligence operations and military strikes, they systematically eliminated Al-Qaeda's leadership. Osama bin Laden and other key leaders were killed. The organizational structure was disrupted. Communication between cells was severed. The shepherds were struck. Al-Qaeda didn't disappear completely, but it fragmented dramatically. Cells became isolated. coordination broke down. Splinter groups formed with different leaders and priorities. ISIS emerged partly from the chaos of Al-Qaeda's organizational collapse. The sheep scattered because their shepherds had been systematically struck. This demonstrates both the power and the limitations of Law 42. The strategy was effective at disrupting the organization. But it didn't eliminate the underlying grievances, ideologies, or individual motivations. New organizations formed from the scattered sheep. The threat morphed rather than disappeared. Striking the shepherds scattered that particular flock but didn't prevent new flocks from forming around new shepherds. This reveals that Law 42 is a tactical tool rather than a strategic solution. It can destroy specific organizations by removing key leaders. But if the underlying conditions that created those organizations remain, new organizations will form. You can strike shepherds repeatedly, but new shepherds will emerge as long as there are sheep who need organizing in conditions that motivate organization. The complete strategy must address both the shepherds and the conditions that create them. Remove the current shepherds to disrupt the immediate organization. But also address the conditions that produce new shepherds and motivate new flocks. Without the second part, striking shepherds is an endless game of whack-a-mole where new shepherds and new flocks keep emerging. So as we close this exploration of Law 42, understand that this law reveals both power and vulnerability in how humans organize. Organizations depend critically on key individuals who act as shepherds. Remove those individuals, and organizations often collapse or fragment dramatically. This creates opportunities for those who want to destroy organizations and vulnerabilities for those building them. If you're attacking an organization, identify the shepherds. Find the key leaders, connectors, experts, systems, or narratives that hold the organization together. Strike those shepherds, and the sheep will scatter. Focus your efforts on removing key dependencies rather than fighting the entire organization. Decapitation is often more effective than conventional confrontation. If you're building an organization, recognize that concentrating power in key individuals creates effectiveness but also vulnerability. Invest in leadership depth, knowledge distribution, redundant systems, and resilient narratives. Don't allow your organization to depend too heavily on any single shepherd, including yourself. Build structures that can survive decapitation. Understand the fundamental trade-off between effectiveness and resilience. Strong shepherds create coordinated, effective flocks but vulnerable organizations. Distributed leadership creates resilient organizations but less coordinated, less effective action. Choose consciously which you need more in your context, but don't pretend you can maximize both simultaneously. Strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. But also remember that scattered sheep can regroup around new shepherds. That resilient organizations build depth that survives decapitation. That the most sophisticated organizations balance effectiveness through some concentration of leadership with resilience through systematic distribution of critical knowledge and capabilities. The shepherd-sheep dynamic is fundamental to human organization. It cannot be eliminated. It can only be managed with awareness of its power and its vulnerabilities. Master Law 42 by understanding when to strike shepherds, when to protect them, and when to avoid becoming a shepherd whose removal would scatter everything you've built. But let me take you even deeper into the mechanisms of organizational dependence and how shepherds become indispensable in ways that create catastrophic vulnerability. Understanding these mechanisms at a granular level reveals exactly how to identify critical shepherds and exactly how to defend against their removal. Think about how individual shepherds become indispensable over time. It's usually not a deliberate process. It's gradual accumulation of dependencies that no one notices until it's too late. The founder makes all early decisions because there's no one else. The expert becomes the go-to person because they're fastest at solving problems. The connector naturally facilitates relationships because they're personable and well-networked. These organic processes create concentration of critical functions. The problem is that organizations tend to optimize for efficiency in the short term rather than resilience in the long term. When you have someone who's really good at something, the efficient move is to have them do it rather than training others. When you have someone who knows how something works, the efficient move is to ask them rather than documenting the process. When you have someone who has key relationships, the efficient move is to leverage those relationships rather than building redundant connections. Each of these efficient short-term decisions creates long-term dependency. The person who does things becomes the only person who can do them. The person who knows things becomes the only repository of that knowledge. The person who has relationships becomes the only connection to critical partners or clients. Efficiency creates the shepherd whose removal would scatter the sheep, and the organization doesn't realize it's happening until the shepherd is gone. This suggests that building resilient organizations requires deliberately choosing inefficiency in specific ways. You must have multiple people who can do critical tasks even when one person is faster or better. You must document knowledge even when it's faster to just ask the expert. You must build redundant relationships even when one person already has strong connections. This feels wasteful and slow, but it's insurance against catastrophic failure when shepherds are struck. Most organizations won't make these investments because the costs are immediate and visible while the benefits are distant and hypothetical. It seems wasteful to train multiple people when one expert suffices. It seems bureaucratic to document everything when you can just ask the person who knows. It seems redundant to build multiple relationships when one strong connection works. So organizations remain vulnerable until they experience the catastrophic cost of losing a shepherd, at which point they learn the hard way. Now let me show you how Law 42 operates in the context of customer relationships and how organizations often concentrate customer relationships in individual salespeople or account managers in ways that create severe vulnerability. When those individuals leave, the customers often leave with them because the relationship is personal rather than organizational. Think about professional services firms where senior partners have deep personal relationships with major clients. Those relationships might represent millions or tens of millions in annual revenue. When the partner leaves or retires, clients often follow them to their next firm. The organization loses not just the partner but the revenue stream the partner controlled. The shepherd of those client relationships was struck, and the client sheep scattered. This is why retention of client-facing employees is so critical and why competition for them is so intense. Everyone understands that these people are shepherds of revenue. Lose them to a competitor, and you lose the revenue they control. Recruit them from a competitor, and you gain the revenue they bring with them. The strategic value of these individuals far exceeds their direct compensation because of the revenue they shepherd. The defense requires systematically transitioning client relationships from personal to organizational. Multiple people from your organization develop relationships with each client. The organization as a brand becomes the relationship rather than any individual. Processes and systems deliver value rather than personal service from specific individuals. This is difficult because clients often prefer dealing with individuals they know and trust rather than organizational systems. But organizations that fail to make this transition remain vulnerable. Their revenue is shepherded by individuals whose departure would scatter that revenue. They're one resignation or one successful poach away from losing significant portions of their business. The efficiency of personal relationships creates the vulnerability of personal dependency. Let me take you into how Law 42 operates in creative and intellectual contexts where entire fields or disciplines can depend on a few key thinkers whose work serves as foundation for everyone else. Remove those thinkers or discredit their work, and entire research programs can collapse. Think about scientific fields built on specific theoretical frameworks developed by pioneering researchers. Everyone in the field works within or extends that framework. Conferences, journals, funding, careers, all organized around the foundational theory. If that theory is decisively falsified or the key figures are discredited, the entire field can go into crisis. The intellectual shepherd was struck, and the research sheep scatter into other fields or different approaches. You see this when paradigms shift in science. Newtonian physics was the shepherd framework for centuries. When Einstein showed its limitations and quantum mechanics emerged, the field fragmented. Some physicists moved to the new paradigms. Some tried to salvage Newtonian approaches for limited domains. Some left physics entirely. The intellectual sheep scattered when their shepherd framework was struck, though eventually they reorganized around new shepherds. Or consider academic disciplines built around particular methodologies or theoretical schools. When those approaches are challenged or fall out of favor, entire departments and journals can collapse. Careers built around the dominant approach become obsolete. Students trained in that tradition struggle to find positions. The academic sheep scatter because their methodological shepherd was struck. This reveals that ideas and frameworks can be shepherds just as much as people can. Challenging or removing the right idea can scatter organizations built around that idea. This is intellectual decapitation, and it can be just as devastating as removing human leadership. The defense is building intellectual foundations that aren't dependent on single frameworks or single thinkers but that draw on multiple sources and remain adaptable to new evidence. Now let me show you how Law 42 operates in supply chain and logistical contexts where organizations depend on critical suppliers or partners whose disruption can collapse entire operations. These external shepherds create vulnerabilities that most organizations don't fully appreciate until the shepherd is struck. Think about manufacturing companies dependent on single suppliers for critical components. If that supplier has problems, production stops immediately. The manufacturer might have inventory of finished products, sales channels, marketing, everything except the one component they need. The supplier shepherd was struck, and the manufacturing operation scatters into idle workers and unfulfilled orders. Or consider platforms dependent on critical infrastructure providers. Cloud services, payment processors, communication networks. If any critical provider has outages or ends service, the platform can become completely non-functional. The infrastructure shepherd was struck, and the platform's users scatter to alternatives because they can't access the service. The Toyota production system in just-in-time manufacturing created incredible efficiency by minimizing inventory and maximizing supplier coordination. But this efficiency created vulnerability. When the Fukushima earthquake disrupted Japanese suppliers in 2011, global automotive production collapsed. The supplier shepherds were struck, and the manufacturing sheep scattered into idleness until supply chains could be rebuilt. The defense is diversifying critical dependencies. Multiple suppliers for key components. Multiple infrastructure providers for essential services. Inventory buffers that allow continued operation during supply disruptions. All of this reduces efficiency but increases resilience. Once again, we see the fundamental trade-off between efficiency and resilience playing out in how organizations manage dependencies. Let me take you into how Law 42 operates in media and communication contexts where controlling key communication channels allows striking shepherds who depend on those channels to reach their sheep. Cut off the shepherd's ability to communicate, and the sheep scatter because they can't receive direction or coordination. Think about how governments respond to movements they want to suppress. They shut down communication channels. Block social media. Cut off internet. Jam broadcasts. The movement leaders might remain free, but they can't communicate with followers. The shepherd remains but can't reach the sheep, which has the same effect as striking the shepherd. The sheep scatter because they're cut off from the shepherd's coordination and direction. Or consider how platforms can destroy dependent businesses by changing algorithms or policies. YouTubers dependent on recommendation algorithms. Sellers dependent on Amazon's platform. App developers dependent on Apple's App Store. If the platform changes policies or algorithms in ways that cut off access to audiences, businesses can collapse overnight. The platform was the shepherd connecting businesses to customers. Change or remove that shepherd connection, and the customer sheep scatter. This reveals a modern form of Law 42 where control over communication and distribution creates power to strike shepherds by cutting off their connection to followers. You don't remove the leader. You remove their ability to lead by preventing communication with followers. This is just as effective as physical removal of the leader and often easier to implement. The defense is maintaining multiple channels of communication and multiple paths to reach audiences. Don't depend entirely on any single platform or distribution channel. Build direct relationships where possible. Create own channels alongside platform-dependent ones. This reduces efficiency because you're duplicating communication infrastructure, but it prevents being decapitated through platform control. Now let me show you how Law 42 operates in financial contexts where organizations depend on critical funding sources whose removal can cause immediate collapse even when the underlying business is sound. Financial shepherds are particularly powerful because they can be struck remotely through financial mechanisms. Think about startups dependent on venture capital funding. The VC firm is effectively a shepherd controlling the startup's ability to operate. If the VC doesn't provide the next funding round, the startup often dies immediately. Not because the technology failed or the market disappeared, but because the financial shepherd withdrew support. The sheep scatter into unemployment because funding ended. Or businesses dependent on lines of credit or specific lenders. If the lender calls the loan or refuses to extend credit, the business can collapse even if it's operationally profitable. The business needs the credit to manage cash flow, pay suppliers, maintain operations. The financial shepherd was struck, and the business sheep scatter into bankruptcy or fire sale. The defense is diversifying funding sources and maintaining financial reserves. Multiple investors or lenders so no single source can kill you by withdrawing. Cash reserves that allow continued operation during funding transitions. Lower dependence on external financing through profitability or revenue financing. All of this reduces financial vulnerability to having your funding shepherd struck. But many organizations optimize for maximum leverage and minimum reserves because that maximizes growth and returns in good times. This financial efficiency creates vulnerability to financial decapitation in bad times. When the funding shepherd is struck, organizations with no reserves and no alternative funding sources collapse immediately regardless of operational quality. Let me take you into how Law 42 operates in legal and regulatory contexts where governments can strike organizational shepherds through legal action that removes leadership or constrains operations. Legal prosecution is a form of striking shepherds that democracies and legal systems make available as an alternative to physical violence. Think about how governments target organized crime. They prosecute leaders under RICO statutes or similar laws. Remove the organizational leadership through legal imprisonment. Without leadership, organized crime groups often fragment into smaller, less organized, less dangerous groups. The legal system struck the shepherds, and the criminal sheep scattered. Or regulatory actions that constrain or prohibit organizations. Antitrust breakups that divide companies. Regulatory restrictions that prevent certain business models. Court orders that prohibit specific practices. These legal strikes can destroy organizations or force radical restructuring. The legal shepherd of permission to operate was struck, and the organizational sheep scatter. This reveals that legal and regulatory frameworks are themselves shepherds that organizations depend on. Changes to laws or regulations can strike these shepherds and scatter organizations built around previous legal frameworks. This is why organizations invest heavily in lobbying and legal compliance. They're defending against potential legal decapitation. The defense is building business models that don't depend on regulatory arbitrage or legal loopholes. Operating clearly within legal and regulatory bounds. Maintaining relationships with regulators. Having legal expertise to navigate changing frameworks. Organizations that depend on questionable legal positions or regulatory gaps remain vulnerable to legal strikes that remove those shepherds and scatter their business models. Now let me address the ethical dimensions of Law 42 because deliberately striking shepherds to scatter sheep raises moral questions about targeting individuals and disrupting organizations. When is it ethical to employ decapitation strategies? And when does it cross into assassination or unjust targeting? In warfare, targeting military commanders is generally considered ethical and standard practice. Commanders are combatants who make them legitimate targets. Removing them disrupts enemy military capability and potentially reduces overall casualties by ending conflicts faster. The ethical framework of warfare accepts striking military shepherds. In business competition, poaching key employees is generally considered ethical and normal competitive behavior. People have the right to change employers. Companies have the right to recruit talent. As long as contracts are honored and intellectual property is respected, striking competitors' shepherds through recruitment is acceptable business competition, but in other contexts, striking shepherds becomes ethically questionable or clearly wrong. Assassinating political leaders violates laws and norms against political violence. Sabotaging civilian infrastructure targets noncombatants. Spreading disinformation to discredit intellectual leaders is manipulation rather than legitimate argument. The ethics depend heavily on context, methods, and the nature of the conflict. The general principle seems to be that striking shepherds is ethical when it's within the accepted rules and norms of the domain. Military targeting in warfare. Employee recruitment in business. Intellectual challenge in academia. It becomes unethical when it violates those norms through violence, deception, or targeting of non-legitimate targets. But the lines aren't always clear, which means ethical judgment is required rather than simple rule following. Let me show you one more extended case study that demonstrates both offensive and defensive applications of Law 42 at the highest level of complexity. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Microsoft was dominant in operating systems and office software. They seemed unstoppable. But they were vulnerable because their dominance depended on specific technology shepherds. Open source movements recognized this vulnerability and struck the technology shepherds that Microsoft's dominance depended on. Linux challenged Windows as an operating system. OpenOffice challenged Microsoft Office. Firefox challenged Internet Explorer. These weren't just alternative products. They were strategic strikes at the shepherd technologies that organized Microsoft's ecosystem. The attacks didn't destroy Microsoft, but they disrupted dominance and forced adaptation. Server markets shifted to Linux. Office alternatives reduced pricing power. Browser competition ended Internet Explorer's dominance. By striking the technology shepherds, open source scattered some of Microsoft's sheep into alternative ecosystems. Microsoft's defense was building resilience through diversification. Cloud services through Azure. Gaming through Xbox. Professional networking through LinkedIn. Hardware through Surface. Search through Bing. Multiple shepherds rather than dependence on Windows and Office alone. When some shepherds were struck, others remained. This demonstrates sophisticated understanding of Law 42 on both sides. Attackers identified critical technology shepherds and struck them. Defenders diversified to ensure no single shepherd's removal would collapse the entire organization. The result was transformation rather than destruction, which is often the outcome when both sides understand the law deeply. So as we truly close this deep exploration of Law 42, understand that the shepherd-sheep dynamic operates at every level of human organization from small teams to global institutions. Every organization has shepherds whose removal would cause various degrees of scattering. Identifying these dependencies is essential for both attacking and defending organizations. The fundamental tension is between efficiency and resilience. Concentrating critical functions in capable shepherds creates efficiency and effectiveness but vulnerability to decapitation. Distributing critical functions among multiple people and systems creates resilience but reduces efficiency and coordination. Every organization must navigate this trade-off consciously rather than accidentally creating vulnerabilities through pursuit of efficiency alone. If you're building organizations, recognize that every shepherd you create is a potential vulnerability. Invest in depth, redundancy, and distribution of critical functions. Document knowledge. Cross-train people. Build redundant systems. Diversify dependencies. These investments feel wasteful in the short term but prevent catastrophic collapse when shepherds are inevitably struck. If you're competing against organizations, identify their shepherds and strike them strategically. Target key leaders. Recruit essential experts. Disrupt critical suppliers. Challenge foundational ideas. Cut communication channels. The most efficient way to defeat an organization is often striking the right shepherd rather than fighting the entire flock. Strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. But build organizations where removing any single shepherd doesn't scatter everyone. Balance the effectiveness of leadership with the resilience of distributed capabilities. But let me take you even deeper into the psychology of followership and why sheep remain sheep even when they could potentially function independently. Understanding this psychological dimension reveals why striking shepherds is so devastatingly effective and why organizations remain vulnerable even when followers are individually capable. Think about what happens psychologically when people become followers in an organization. They develop learned helplessness in specific domains. They stop thinking independently about strategic direction because that's the leader's job. They stop building relationships with external partners because that's handled. They stop maintaining certain knowledge because someone else is the expert. Each delegation of responsibility creates psychological dependency. This isn't stupidity or weakness. It's rational specialization and division of labor. In complex organizations, people cannot maintain expertise and relationships in all domains. They must delegate and trust others. But this necessary specialization creates the shepherd-sheep dynamic where people become psychologically dependent on shepherds even when they're individually talented and capable. The followers aren't actually sheep in the sense of being stupid or passive. They're specialists who have rationally delegated certain functions to other specialists, which creates structural interdependence. When the shepherd specialist is removed, the specialists in other domains cannot immediately perform the shepherd's function because they've specialized away from it. The organizational sheep scatter not from incompetence but from specialization-induced interdependence. This reveals why striking shepherds works even in organizations of highly capable people. NASA scientists are individually brilliant but depend on mission directors for coordination. Special Forces soldiers are individually elite but depend on commanders for strategic direction. Investment banks have brilliant analysts but depend on relationship managers for client connections. Intelligence doesn't prevent the shepherd-sheep dynamic because the dynamic emerges from specialized interdependence, not from capability differences. The implication is that organizations of capable people require just as much attention to shepherd vulnerability as organizations of less capable people. Maybe more, because capable people can specialize more deeply and create more sophisticated interdependencies that are harder to untangle when shepherds are struck. The more advanced the organization, the more vulnerable it potentially is to strategic decapitation of key coordination nodes. Now let me show you how Law 42 operates in merger and acquisition contexts where companies deliberately strike competitors' shepherds by acquiring the whole organization to absorb key talent. This is corporate decapitation through acquisition rather than competition. Think about acquihires where large companies buy startups primarily for the team rather than the technology. They're striking the startup shepherd, the founder and key employees who built the technology and culture. By absorbing these shepherds into the acquiring company, they scatter the original startup's independent existence while preserving the talent for their own purposes. Or consider how consulting firms acquire smaller specialized firms primarily to gain the client relationships and expertise of the partners. They're not buying revenue streams or brand value. They're buying the shepherds who control relationships and knowledge. Once acquired, the smaller firm's independent identity scatters while the shepherds are integrated into the larger organization. This is sophisticated application of Law 42 because you're not just striking the shepherd to scatter the sheep. You're capturing the shepherd to redirect the sheep toward your purposes. The startup's team becomes your team. The consulting firm's clients become your clients. You've turned a competitor's strength into your strength by striking and capturing their shepherd. The defense against this is building organizational identity and culture that's stronger than individual loyalty to shepherds. If your organization is just a collection of people following specific leaders, it's vulnerable to acquisition-based decapitation. But if your organization has shared mission, values, and identity that transcends individual shepherds, it's more resistant to being scattered even when key people are acquired away. This is why some organizations survive the departure of founders and key leaders while others collapse. The survivors built organizational identity beyond individual shepherds. The failures were just collections of people following specific individuals, so when those individuals were struck or acquired, the organizational identity scattered with them. Let me take you into how Law 42 operates in educational contexts where removing master teachers or closing key programs can scatter entire fields of study and end intellectual lineages that took generations to build. Think about academic fields where knowledge and methodology are transmitted through mentorship relationships. A master professor trains a generation of students who become the next generation of professors. Those students train the next generation. This creates intellectual lineages where removing the master can end the entire tradition. When a legendary professor retires or dies without having trained sufficient successors, entire research programs can disappear. The methodological knowledge, the tacit insights, the research relationships, all concentrated in that individual. Their departure scatters the intellectual sheep who depended on them for training, guidance, and legitimacy. The field continues, but the specific tradition that professor embodied often ends. Or consider what happens when universities close departments or programs for financial reasons. They're striking educational shepherds that organized student pathways and faculty careers. The students scatter to other institutions. The faculty scatter to other positions. The intellectual community that program created fragments and often never reconstitutes because the organizational scaffold that held it together is gone. Or consider what happens when universities close departments or programs for financial reasons. They're striking educational shepherds that organized student pathways and faculty careers. The students scatter to other institutions. The faculty scatter to other positions. The intellectual community that program created fragments and often never reconstitutes because the organizational scaffold that held it together is gone. This is why academic fields with strong institutional homes are more resilient than those dependent on specific individuals. Physics survived because it's institutionalized across universities. Specific schools of thought within physics come and go as individual shepherds retire or die. Institutionalization creates resilience against shepherd removal, while dependence on individuals creates vulnerability. The lesson for knowledge preservation is that dependence on master practitioners creates fragility. The master must document, must train multiple successors, must build institutional structures that outlive individuals. Otherwise, their knowledge scatters when they're struck by retirement or death. The most valuable intellectual traditions are those that successfully transition from embodiment in individuals to embodiment in institutions and documentation. Now let me show you how Law 42 operates in technological transitions where new technologies can strike the shepherd technologies that entire industries depend on, causing massive disruption and scattering of established businesses. Think about what happened to the music industry when digital distribution emerged. Physical distribution was the shepherd technology that organized the entire industry. Record stores, distributors, logistics, manufacturing, all built around physical media. When digital distribution struck that shepherd technology, the industry's sheep scattered into bankruptcy and transformation. Or consider what happened to taxi industries when ride-sharing apps emerged. Taxi medallions and dispatch systems were shepherd technologies organizing urban transportation. When apps struck those shepherds by creating alternative coordination mechanisms, traditional taxi businesses scattered into decline while new businesses emerged around the new shepherds. The pattern repeats constantly in technology. A shepherd technology organizes an industry. Everything builds around and depends on that technology. A new technology strikes the shepherd by providing superior functionality or economics. The industry built around the old shepherd scatters while new industry emerges around the new shepherd. This is creative destruction operating through Law 42. The businesses that survive these transitions are those that recognize when their shepherd technology is vulnerable and diversify before it's struck. Music labels that invested in digital distribution early. Taxi companies that built their own apps. They didn't prevent their old shepherds from being struck, but they positioned themselves to migrate to new shepherds rather than scattering with the old ones. But most businesses fail to recognize their dependence on shepherd technologies until those shepherds are struck. They assume the current technological paradigm is permanent because it's all they've known. When new technology strikes their shepherd, they scatter into irrelevance or bankruptcy because they have no position in the new technological paradigm that's replacing the old one. Let me take you into how Law 42 operates in cultural and artistic movements where removing key figures or venues can scatter entire creative communities and end cultural moments that seemed vibrant and permanent. Think about art movements that coalesce around specific galleries, cafes, or neighborhoods. The Impressionists in Montmartre. The Beats in San Francisco. The grunge scene in Seattle. These movements depended on physical spaces and key individuals who acted as shepherds organizing the community. When those spaces closed or those individuals moved on, the movement scattered. Or music scenes that depend on specific venues or producers. CBGB for punk. Sun Studios for rockabilly. Specific clubs for various electronic music scenes. The venue is the shepherd that organizes the scene. Close the venue, and the scene scatters. The musicians remain, but the cohesive scene that venue enabled fragments into individuals without a coordinating center. This reveals that creative communities are just as vulnerable to Law 42 as formal organizations. The artist collective depends on the studio space or key organizer. The music scene depends on the venue or influential DJ. The literary movement depends on the journal or key editor. Strike these shepherds, and the creative sheep scatter even though the individual artists remain and continue creating. The defense is building multiple venues and multiple organizers so no single shepherd is critical. Distributed creative communities that exist across many spaces with many coordinators. This is less efficient than concentrated scenes because it lacks the intensity and cross-pollination of everyone in one place. But it's more resilient because striking any single shepherd doesn't scatter the entire community. Now let me show you how Law 42 operates in family systems and how the removal of family shepherds through death, divorce, or estrangement can scatter family cohesion and end family traditions that seemed permanent. Think about extended families held together by a matriarch or patriarch who organizes gatherings, maintains relationships, and preserves family identity. When that person dies, the extended family often fragments. Siblings stop gathering regularly. Cousins lose touch. Family traditions end. The family sheep scatter because the shepherd who organized family cohesion is gone. Or families fractured by divorce where one parent was the primary relationship maintainer. After divorce, children may lose contact with one side of the family because the parent who maintained those relationships is no longer in the coordinating position. The family network scatters not because relationships were bad but because the shepherd who maintained them was removed from that role. This demonstrates that informal organizations like families are subject to Law 42 just as much as formal organizations. Families depend on shepherds who maintain cohesion, coordinate gatherings, preserve traditions, and manage relationships. Remove those shepherds through death, illness, divorce, or geographic separation, and family coherence often scatters dramatically. The defense is distributing family coordination functions among multiple people so no single person's removal collapses family cohesion. Multiple people organizing gatherings. Multiple people maintaining relationships with different branches. Multiple people preserving and transmitting family traditions. This requires conscious effort because families naturally develop primary coordinators who become shepherds. Resisting this centralization requires deliberate distribution of roles. Let me take you into how Law 42 operates in information ecosystems and how removing key information sources can scatter communities that depend on those sources for shared understanding and coordination. Think about online communities built around specific websites, forums, or content creators. The site or creator is the shepherd that organizes the community. Shut down the site or the creator stops producing, and the community scatters. The individual members remain but the coordinating center that organized them into a community is gone. Or news organizations that provide shared information foundation for communities. When local newspapers close, communities lose shared information sources. People scatter into fragmented information environments with no common factual foundation. The newspaper was the shepherd organizing shared understanding. Its removal scatters the informational sheep into isolated individual information bubbles. This is increasingly important in digital age where information communities depend on platform shepherds. Reddit communities depend on specific subreddits. Discord communities depend on specific servers. Twitter communities depend on specific hashtags or accounts. Strike these shepherds by banning subreddits, shutting down servers, or suspending key accounts, and the communities scatter even though the individual members remain. The pattern is universal. Information communities depend on information shepherds. Remove those shepherds, and the communities fragment because they lose their coordinating information sources. The defense is building communities across multiple platforms and multiple sources so no single shepherd's removal scatters everyone. But this is difficult because communities naturally concentrate around convenient single sources. Now let me address the question of whether organizations should even try to avoid the shepherd-sheep dynamic or whether it's so fundamental to human psychology that resistance is futile. Can organizations function effectively without shepherds, or is trying to build shepherd-less organizations just creating different vulnerabilities? The experiments with flat organizations, distributed leadership, and consensus decision-making reveal the challenges of avoiding shepherds. These structures often become inefficient, slow, and conflict-prone because humans are wired for hierarchy. Without clear shepherds, informal hierarchies emerge anyway, but now they're hidden and unaccountable. Or decisions deadlock because no one has clear authority. Some argue this proves shepherds are necessary and the vulnerability they create is unavoidable cost of organizational function. You can minimize shepherd vulnerability through depth and redundancy, but you cannot eliminate it because human psychology requires coordination centers. Trying to build organizations without shepherds is like trying to build cities without infrastructure. Theoretically possible but practically self-limiting. Others argue that accepting shepherd necessity is defeatist and that organizations can function through distributed networks without coordination centers. Technology enables coordination without shepherds. Blockchain provides coordination without central authorities. Open source shows production without traditional management. These proofs demonstrate shepherd-less organization is possible. The truth is probably that both models work in different contexts with different trade-offs. Hierarchical organizations with clear shepherds are effective for certain types of coordination but vulnerable to decapitation. Distributed networks without clear shepherds are resilient to decapitation but limited in certain types of complex coordination. Choose based on context rather than assuming one model is universally superior. Let me show you one final extended case study that demonstrates the full complexity of Law 42 operating across organizational, technological, and social dimensions simultaneously. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 demonstrates what happens when multiple shepherds are struck simultaneously across an entire civilization. The Soviet system depended on the Communist Party as organizational shepherd coordinating the entire society. It depended on centralized planning as the shepherd coordinating economic activity. It depended on Marxist-Leninist ideology as the shepherd organizing shared beliefs and legitimizing the system. It depended on military power as the shepherd maintaining the empire and deterring challenges. By the late 80s, all these shepherds were being struck simultaneously. Gorbachev's reforms weakened the party's organizational monopoly. Economic stagnation revealed central planning's failure. Ideological confidence collapsed as people stopped believing communist mythology. Military power eroded as Afghanistan demonstrated limits and economic crisis reduced military capability. The result was not gradual decline but sudden collapse. Once multiple shepherds were struck, Soviet society scattered at remarkable speed. The empire fragmented into independent states. The economy collapsed into chaos. The party dissolved. The ideology was abandoned. People scattered from collective identity into individual survival. Multiple shepherds struck simultaneously caused civilizational-level scattering. This demonstrates that complex systems can have multiple shepherds operating at different levels. Political shepherds. Economic shepherds. Ideological shepherds. Military shepherds. When the system is healthy, these shepherds reinforce each other. When multiple shepherds are struck, the system can collapse catastrophically because the mutually reinforcing structure becomes mutually destroying as each shepherd's weakness undermines the others. The lesson is that robust systems need resilience at multiple levels. Backup shepherds at each level. Some shepherds that can survive the striking of others. Mechanisms for reconstituting struck shepherds before total collapse. The Soviet system had no such resilience. It was a house of cards where multiple critical shepherds were struck simultaneously, causing comprehensive collapse. So as we absolutely finally close this comprehensive exploration of Law 42, understand that the shepherd-sheep dynamic operates at every scale from small teams to civilizations. Every organized human activity depends on shepherds for coordination. Strike those shepherds, and the coordinated activity scatters into uncoordinated individuals. This law is simultaneously a weapon for attacking organizations and a warning for building them. Use it to identify and strike opponents' shepherds. Use it to recognize and protect your own vulnerabilities. Use it to build resilience through shepherd redundancy and distributed critical functions. The fundamental reality is that human organization requires coordination, coordination requires coordinators, and coordinators are vulnerable to being struck. This creates eternal tension between effectiveness through centralization and resilience through distribution. Navigate this tension consciously, understanding the trade-offs, rather than accidentally creating critical vulnerabilities through pursuit of efficiency alone. Strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. Protect your shepherds and build backup shepherds. Recognize when you're becoming a shepherd whose removal would scatter everything. That's the complete wisdom of Law 42. That's everything. Or news organizations that provide shared information foundation for communities. When local newspapers close, communities lose shared information sources. People scatter into fragmented information environments with no common factual foundation. The newspaper was the shepherd organizing shared understanding. Its removal scatters the informational sheep into isolated individual information bubbles. This is increasingly important in digital age where information communities depend on platform shepherds. Reddit communities depend on specific subreddits. Discord communities depend on specific servers. Twitter communities depend on specific hashtags or accounts. Strike these shepherds by banning subreddits, shutting down servers, or suspending key accounts, and the communities scatter even though the individual members remain. The pattern is universal. Information communities depend on information shepherds. Remove those shepherds, and the communities fragment because they lose their coordinating information sources. The defense is building communities across multiple platforms and multiple sources so no single shepherd's removal scatters everyone. But this is difficult because communities naturally concentrate around convenient single sources. Now let me address the question of whether organizations should even try to avoid the shepherd-sheep dynamic or whether it's so fundamental to human psychology that resistance is futile. Can organizations function effectively without shepherds? Or is trying to build shepherd-less organizations just creating different vulnerabilities? The experiments with flat organizations, distributed leadership, and consensus decision-making reveal the challenges of avoiding shepherds. These structures often become inefficient, slow, and conflict-prone because humans are wired for hierarchy. Without clear shepherds, informal hierarchies emerge anyway, but now they're hidden and unaccountable. Or decisions deadlock because no one has clear authority. Some argue this proves shepherds are necessary and the vulnerability they create is unavoidable cost of organizational function. You can minimize shepherd vulnerability through depth and redundancy, but you cannot eliminate it because human psychology requires coordination centers. Trying to build organizations without shepherds is like trying to build cities without infrastructure. Theoretically possible but practically self-limiting. Others argue that accepting shepherd necessity is defeatist and that organizations can function through distributed networks without coordination centers. Technology enables coordination without shepherds. Blockchain provides coordination without central authorities. Open source shows production without traditional management. These proofs demonstrate shepherd-less organization is possible. The truth is probably that both models work in different contexts with different trade-offs. Hierarchical organizations with clear shepherds are effective for certain types of coordination but vulnerable to decapitation. Distributed networks without clear shepherds are resilient to decapitation but limited in certain types of complex coordination. Choose based on context rather than assuming one model is universally superior. Let me show you one final extended case study that demonstrates the full complexity of Law 42 operating across organizational, technological, and social dimensions simultaneously. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 demonstrates what happens when multiple shepherds are struck simultaneously across an entire civilization. The Soviet system depended on the Communist Party as organizational shepherd coordinating the entire society. It depended on centralized planning as the shepherd coordinating economic activity. It depended on Marxist-Leninist ideology as the shepherd organizing shared beliefs and legitimizing the system. It depended on military power as the shepherd maintaining the empire and deterring challenges. By the late 80s, all these shepherds were being struck simultaneously. Gorbachev's reforms weakened the party's organizational monopoly. Economic stagnation revealed central planning's failure. Ideological confidence collapsed as people stopped believing communist mythology. Military power eroded as Afghanistan demonstrated limits and economic crisis reduced military capability. The result was not gradual decline but sudden collapse. Once multiple shepherds were struck, Soviet society scattered at remarkable speed. The empire fragmented into independent states. The economy collapsed into chaos. The party dissolved. The ideology was abandoned. People scattered from collective identity into individual survival. Multiple shepherds struck simultaneously caused civilizational-level scattering. This demonstrates that complex systems can have multiple shepherds operating at different levels. Political shepherds. Economic shepherds. Ideological shepherds. Military shepherds. When the system is healthy, these shepherds reinforce each other. When multiple shepherds are struck, the system can collapse catastrophically because the mutually reinforcing structure becomes mutually destroying as each shepherd's weakness undermines the others. The lesson is that robust systems need resilience at multiple levels. Backup shepherds at each level. Some shepherds that can survive the striking of others. Mechanisms for reconstituting struck shepherds before total collapse. The Soviet system had no such resilience. It was a house of cards where multiple critical shepherds were struck simultaneously, causing comprehensive collapse. So as we absolutely finally close this comprehensive exploration of Law 42, understand that the shepherd-sheep dynamic operates at every scale from small teams to civilizations. Every organized human activity depends on shepherds for coordination. Strike those shepherds, and the coordinated activity scatters into uncoordinated individuals. This law is simultaneously a weapon for attacking organizations and a warning for building them. Use it to identify and strike opponents' shepherds. Use it to recognize and protect your own vulnerabilities. Use it to build resilience through shepherd redundancy and distributed critical functions. The fundamental reality is that human organization requires coordination, coordination requires coordinators, and coordinators are vulnerable to being struck. This creates eternal tension between effectiveness through centralization and resilience through distribution. Navigate this tension consciously, understanding the trade-offs, rather than accidentally creating critical vulnerabilities through pursuit of efficiency alone. Strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. Protect your shepherds and build backup shepherds. Recognize when you're becoming a shepherd whose removal would scatter everything. That's the complete wisdom of Law 42. That's everything.